What does the Axis Virus, the Groove Synthesis Third Wave, the Waldorf Blofeld, the Waldorf Microwave XT, the Waldorf M, the Korg DW8000, the Korg Microkorg, the Korg Modwave, the Arturia Microfreak, the Arturia Mini Freak, the UDO Super 6, and the oldest one I've got here, the Prophet VS, as well as Eurorack modules like the Modbap Osiris and the Erica Synths Black Wavetable VCO, and studios in a box like the Polyam Tracker have in common with Native Instruments Massive X, Arturia's Pigments, the ubiquitous Serum, and what I'm going to be using today, the Waldorf Microwavr 1 plugin. Well, if you hadn't already guessed it, with all those Waldorfs and the name of the Erica Synths Wavetable VCO, they've all got wavetables. Well, they've all got digital waves at least. The DW8000, the Super 6, the Prophet VS, and the Microkorg have got waves or digital waves, but they don't have wavetables. There is a distinction, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But recently I was playing with the Model 77 from Softtube, and someone had written in the comments when I'd uploaded my video, surely we're all fed up of virtual analog synths by now. And while I was reading that, I've been looking at this. It's the new Waldorf Microwavr 1 plugin, which is a recreation of the original Microwave. And yes, it is another plugin of another vintage synth, but it's not strictly a virtual analog, obviously, because it uses these digital waves in wavetables. And I took a look around the studio and realized all these different things use wavetables or digital waves, and they're often overlooked really, and definitely misunderstood. So I thought, as part of my sort of patches on the fly, sort of synth tutorials, I put something together about wavetables, what they are, why you'd use them, when you'd use them, and in particular, where you get all that lo-fi, lovely, grungy goodness from. And I won't go into everything like making your own waves, because I've got another video on that, and I'll stick a link to this in the description. And once you've watched this, that one may make a lot more sense. So yeah, here I'm going to look at what they are, when you'd use them, and why they're so good, and why they can be so bad. They're really, really good. So here then, like I say, is the new Microwavr 1 emulation from Waldorf, and very nice it is too. It's an exacting replica of the original, and it's got that real vintage tone. And I'm using it here for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's got this lovely interface and everything's really nice and clear on it, really easy to understand what's happening. And if you've got a good way of showing something, it just makes it easier to do stuff. And secondly, possibly more importantly, this is a really good way of showing where you get all that lo-fi goodness from, because it hasn't got anti-aliasing, it hasn't got anti-imaging, it doesn't interpolate for the different pitches, it's got 128 sample long cycles in there, so it's got all the stuff that you get on the old stuff, which is why I think digital synths were maybe looked down upon. They're not quite as crystal clear, or they're definitely not as crystal clear as some analog or most analog synths. So this will explain why. Obviously this is an old synth, so newer synths don't necessarily have all these sort of artifacts in them, or you can switch them in and out like you can on a third wave. So just a really good way of demonstrating it really. And it'll show why things like this Behringer doesn't sound like a vintage VS, even though it's using the same digital wavetables. So coming back to the Microwave then, we've got these two oscillators here, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. They both use the same wavetable as the sound source, but in this wavetable we have got 64 different waves in each of them, and in there we've got a fair old selection of wavetables. And these aren't just random tones put together. You can see in those 3D graphs that they're sort of all related, except for things like this robotics one perhaps. But if we look at something like this, the saw sweep, we're modulating from a sawtooth down to a sine. That's 64 samples that react in the same way as just twisting the filter cutoff knob. And if we look at this sample here, that's from a Minimoog, and that's doing the same thing. We're modulating from a sawtooth down to a sine using the filter. And if we zoom into the actual file at the bottom, what you'll see is we've got sawtooths, and they modulate down to, as we twist the cutoff knob down to sines. So here we've got an individual sine, that's a single cycle. And if we come halfway through, that's sort of on its way to becoming a sine. And at the start, we've got a single cycle of a sawtooth, or at least the sawtooth that I got off whatever moog I used for that. So if you split that sample up into 64 of those single cycles, stick them in a wavetable, you can play it on a wavetable synth. And if we look at what we've got here, that's exactly what this is. So here's the sawtooth, and then go all the way back down to the sines, or that's on the way to the sine, and then scroll through to a sine. And that sample was created using this saw sweep wavetable, just modulating through it. But of course, we can automate our way through that. So let's use an envelope to do the same thing. And what envelope am I using there? I'm using this wave envelope. Let's make it a bit quicker. So you get the idea. The wavetable is a group of single cycle samples that you can modulate through to create all sorts of tones, all sorts of starting points. Just sweeping through a couple of the others. And what's quite cool about some of them is if you modulate them in certain ways, it creates a sort of effect. So this one here, echoes. Let's modulate through that one with an LFO. And there's no delay on that. That's just modulating through the wavetable with a bit of release, because the wavetable sort of pulsates. So there's loads of clever things you can do with them. You get really complex starting points. So it could be something really organic like an organ or a human voice, or it could be a wall full of buchla modula and you've twisted a few knobs on it. Someone samples it. In fact, on the third wave from Groove Synthesis, they've got some buchla samples in there. So someone's got one of these systems, twisted a couple of knobs, and created a wavetable from that. So your starting point, your oscillator, is a really complex thing that you can do all sorts of stuff with. So taking a look at maybe an organ sound. Let's look at this percussive organ. Let's take that off, so we're not modulating through it. But then if we modulate through that wavetable, we've got different organs in here. So in the one oscillator here, got pipe organs and really cool sort of house organs as well. But if we come back to something like that saw sweep, and we come down to this, whoops, and we come down to this sine, when we play high up, sounds like a sine. Let's add some release, make it sound a bit nicer. When we come all the way down the octaves, you get all sorts of lovely, weird artifacts. You've got a simple sine there. The theory is that that sine should be replicated all the way across the keyboard. But the way it works, especially with the vintage ones, we get all these extra harmonics. See all those little things at the top there? And if that was a pure sine, you wouldn't be getting any of this. And I'll come to that in just a second, but just a quick mention of waves versus wavetables. As I say, the DW8000, the Microwavr, Prophet VS, and the Super 6 have waves, but they don't have wavetables, and that's because you can't modulate through them, but you do have those waves as starting points. This is the full bucket FB799, which is a donation-only version of the Korg DW8000, and you can see here, there, the 16 waves we get in it. Nowhere near as complex as what you're getting in the microwave, but much more complex than a saw, a sine, a pulse, and a triangle. And this is what you get in the Microwavr. It's got 64 digital DWGS waves. That's what it calls its digital waveform generator system. Other things that use waves and wavetables are the Ensonics. This is Artoria's version of it. And if we look in here, we've got all different sort of waveforms. These have these trans waves, not wavetables, but there's a similar sort of concept. The Prophet VS can't modulate through wavetables either. It's got one wavetable. It's not really a wavetable because you can't modulate through it, but it's got 128 waves in there, and each of the 4 oscillators can use a different wave, and then use the XY joystick to blend between the different waves. So it sounds like you're modulating through a wavetable, but you're not actually, just playing the different waves and then blending your way through them. And I've got the Prophet VS wavetables on my website in loads of different formats if you're interested in picking them up. The Super 6 only has space for 32 waves, but you can load your own. I've loaded the Prophet VS into that, and it sounds great. Sounds crystal clear. The FPGA oscillators on that run at super, super high speed, so you get really nice, pristine sounds, but you can't modulate through the wavetables. Again, though, you've got 32 to start with, which is, again, loads more than a sine, a sawtooth, a pulse, and a triangle. So it can't all be perfect, though, can it? Otherwise, everything would use digital waveforms and wavetables. So what are the potential pitfalls, and where do you get all that lovely grunginess and lo-fi grime from? Firstly, then, as we move through those wavetables, the stepping that you can get between each of the different waveforms. And this is great because it really does show it doing it. We've got options to turn it off, but it doesn't really work very well on this bit of 80s tech. You can hear that. Let's just increase that time. So we're not getting a really nice smooth transition, are we? Even though it says smooth there. Let's put on to stepped. Yeah, it's a bit smoother there, but something like the third wave makes it really nice and smooth, and you can't really hear the transitions. It's a nice effect, though. The Iridium has a way of, or a setting that you can set it to 2 or to 8 or to 16 waves that you jump through the table, so you can get these nice, really nice little glitchy effects. And if you're looking here, a lot of these wavetables use only a few different waves to create the wavetable. So in this, we're using these, 5 different waves, and then the program interpolates, or the synth interpolates between them. So as we modulate through them, that shape you can see there, this red one here, has been generated by the synth itself. So quite cool, and the reason for doing that obviously was because there's limited space in the memory for something back in the 80s, so you didn't want thousands and thousands of wave shapes in there, so it creates the wave shapes from what it's got in its memory. Now we don't really need that so much, but it just creates all sorts of options there for little glitchy effects and things not sounding quite as good as they should. Although I have to say, it is really quite good at doing this. Because these all sound nice and smooth, don't they? Well, smoothish at least. Let's try another. That's made from only a few waves. Let's modulate through it a bit more. You can still hear the sort of digitalness of it, but there's just 4 waves in that. And it's created all the others. But if you listen carefully, you can hear some digitalness happening there. I don't know if that's got anything to do with the interpolation between the waves or other stuff I'm going to talk about in a minute. But it's just got a nice vibe to it. I made quite a detailed demo of this when putting the Prophet VS versus the third wave demo together, when I was putting the waves from the VS into the third wave and just showing why they sound nice and grungy and why the third wave can recreate it. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But effectively, if you've got a single cycled sample and you're repeating that a number of times, every note needs a different number of cycles because that's what the pitch is. So at the top end of the scale, you'll need less samples. At the bottom end of the scale, so in the low registers, you'll need much longer samples. So when I was creating some samples for the third wave, 128 samples long sample is about an F4 sharp, or an F sharp 4, I should say. So to play something an F#3, I would need 256 samples because it's got to be twice as long. To play something at an F#2, I would need 512 samples. For F#1, I would need 1,000 samples, and for F#0, so right at the bottom of the keyboard, I'd need 2,000 samples in order to repeat at the frequency required. So where have those additional 1,900 samples come from? Because they're not there in the original 128 little samples. I sound like I'm waffling on a lot here, but basically you've got to invent the samples. So you've got to stretch that sample out. The old machines, what they do is they just repeat the sample. So what you end up with is that stepping that you can see. And if we come back to this here and we come down to the sine wave, or the apparent sine wave, if we play it high up, we get what looks like a perfect sine. And that's because it's got the right number of samples for that note. But when we come down the scale, we start to introduce those steps. So you can really see the steps in that there. Let's just make this a lot bigger. So there we've got those steps. So you can literally see the steps there, and those steps are the samples that the synths added, so just repeated the actual sample 16 times or whatever. So you get one sample, then it's added a load of other ones, next one. But because it's got the step in it, you've actually changed the wave shape. Because you've changed the wave shape, you get different harmonics. Because those harmonics are related to the pitch of the note, then they're actually quite musical harmonics. So looking at the frequency analysis, we can see those little peaks at like 5 and 10, and they shouldn't really be there. But they're moving with the notes. They're going down as I go down the keyboard, and they're coming back up as I go up the keyboard, which means that they're quite musically pleasing. They sound like part of the wave because they are part of the wave. You might not have wanted them, but they're there. But I think they're musically pleasing. They give an additional texture. But if you did want a very, very clean sine on something like the third wave, you'd push the button that says interpolate between them, and it interpolates properly between them, and it sounds like a crisp, clean sine. But you can see why people back in the day might think, don't like digital synths, don't like digital oscillators, because I can't get a crisp, clean, low sine out of it. Whereas now we've got options. And that's why software like this proudly announces that it comes along with all those artifacts, because it's the sort of thing you can't get on everything. You've really got to plan for it these days. And that's why something like this doesn't recreate those tones perfectly. Something like the Waldorf M has a mode to do it. The Groove Synthesis third wave has a mode to do it. Something like this doesn't. I'm not having a go at this, by the way. I'm just trying to explain that it's not something that you get with everything. So those vintage vibes nowadays have to be planned for. So the other one that obviously we all know about is aliasing. So what is aliasing? Aliasing happens when the digital calculations go above your top frequency, your Nyquist frequency. But let's just say, for the sake of argument here, the maximum frequency your software is playing with is 20K. And then you've got a harmonic that comes in when you play one of your notes, and the harmonic is 21K. Well, if you haven't got anti-aliasing stuff in there, that extra K will sort of fold back on itself and come in as 19K. And if you've got one at 23K, for example, it'll come back at 17K. If you've got one at 25K, it'll come back at 15K. So what you end up with is all these weird frequencies that aren't related particularly harmonically at all to the base frequency or the fundamental frequency of your tone. And they change quite radically with every key you push. So you get these funny little buzzers, and these do it. So if we come back to this saw sweep and we go up to the sawtooth, let's play our note high. Now you might be able to hear in there, depending on how loud you're playing this, these little things that are wobbling down at the bottom. They shouldn't be there. If I play higher up, you can really hear an odd little tone. But it changes for every note I play. So there, it's not particularly bad. You can hear something way up there. If I go even higher, you can definitely hear This note in particular, you've got all those weird harmonics. And there. So without blowing anyone's eardrums, you can definitely hear those little artifacts in there. And they might not sound like much now, but if you've got a track playing and you've got some little twinkly noises or some high strings, they really do come into the phone. You can hear them. Sometimes it's quite cool, but if you want a nice crisp little bell and you've got those funny little noises in there, it might be distracting or it might be cool. But that's what aliasing is. The old synths didn't have anti-aliasing filters. The new synths do. Again, groove synthesis, you can plug it in, plug it out, that sort of stuff. But part of the beauty or the weird artifacts that you get with these things. So I think I put the third wave up against the PPG, and one of the tests my mate did was check that it was aliasing in just as the disgusting way as the original PPG, because he loved it. It was part of the tone. In fact, the aliasing can be so loud that the tuner picks the wrong note. That's a C. That's meant to be a D. That's meant to be an E. That's meant to be an F. That is a G. That's an A. That's meant to be a B. So it can be quite dramatic. The other little effect you can get that's a bit weird is pitch interpolation, or not having pitch interpolation. And because you need a specific number of samples repeating at a specific number of times per note, you can't actually get the right number of samples to repeat at the right rate per note. You just can't necessarily have anything that relates to 128 samples, for example. So you've got to truncate that or change it in some sort of way. Some people can actually hear the difference in the tuning from note to note because the pitch interpolation isn't quite right. It's not something I've really noticed, and I've tried to test it on this actually, and this says it doesn't have pitch interpolation, but as we just saw with those notes there, they seemed pretty bang on until we hit the aliasing. But maybe the aliasing and the fact that the high up notes are the ones that really do that you really do notice it on, because there's less samples to play with. I think the difference between I think it was a C and a C sharp in the 5th octave was only something like 10 samples difference, but you've got 100 cents between those two notes. So it is sort of quantized to a pitch that isn't necessarily bang on, but not something I say I've really noticed, but it is there. And some people can swear they can actually hear it, and maybe I can, or maybe that's what this is doing here. I don't know. But another really interesting thing is digital distortion you get, and the Microwavr one in particular had this thing called the ASIC bug, and the ASIC bug occurred when you're adding the oscillators together and you get some weird digital truncation error. So it's actually an error in some sort of calculations, and it creates the most disgusting distortion, and this recreates it. So if we've got oscillator 1, then we go over that red line. That's okay at the minute because nothing's playing oscillator 2. Let's play oscillator 2 as well. We go over that line there, and it just gets really moody. In a very, very nice way. If you're trying to avoid it, you're thinking, what's all this weird noise coming in? Then just go with the flow and pump it up. If we take it off, so bring these into sort of normal levels, much smoother, much nicer. We'll whack these volumes up on each of the oscillators. I suspect it's just a Microwavr thing. The XT replicated it. It's got a few different weird digital distortion modes in there, but just something definitely worth showing because that is very, very cool indeed. So if they're so complex, exotic and amazing with all this lo-fi grunginess and all these different things you can do with them, why are they a little bit overlooked? And I think that's because they're so complex. If we look in here, for example, we've got all these different wavetables in this. And there are thousands of wavetables that you can get online. But when you've got such a vast amount of things to start with, it does feel a little bit daunting. So coming back into this, we've got all these different wavetables instead of just having a sawtooth and a pulse. And when I first got the Microwavr XT that's sitting behind me, I was a bit horrified by the fact that I'd have to now learn all these 64 different wavetables. And nowadays, it's actually not that difficult to do it, because looking at here, obviously we've got these little graphics, and the graphics aren't just pretty pictures. They do really show you what's going on, and you can learn to read them really simply. So this one, for example, we can see we've got a sine to start with, and then we go to something quite smooth, but it'll be like a bit of a, what's called resonant, but you'll get some nice extra harmonics coming out. And that's exactly what we're getting. Go to the next one. That's a continuation of the first one, isn't it? And then mallet, I imagine if you go backwards through that, set the wave at the top, and then come back to it quickly. Yeah, you get a sort of mallet type effect. Let's put it back to where it was. Oh, you'll notice on the top here we've got a triangle, a square and a sawtooth, and that's a Waldorf thing. All the tables have the triangle, the sawtooth and the square, and that's because both oscillators on the older ones could only ever play the same wavetable, but if you had a sawtooth or a triangle or a square, you could put them almost like as a sub-oscillator, or just have a different tone really on the second oscillator. But if we don't have to worry about that here, let's come back down to this sine, go to another one, and this one goes from a sine to what looks like a square. But it's not a perfect square, it looks like it's been sampled off something. But you can see it straight away, it's called bellish. So we know what it's going to sound like if we play higher up. Again, something that might not be very simple to make on an analog synth. Looking through a few more of them, that looks quite simple. That's the sort of the sweep, we've seen that before. Let's find one with a few more harmonics in there. So we can see this one's got a load at the back, so we start with a sine. And then something much more resonant. Let's pull this down one so we don't go into those analog waves. And then look at this one, and we can see straight away this is going to sound a little bit edgy. Playing that high up. Let's take the wave envelope off for a second. So if we come down to those bass frequencies, a little bit of filter on there, maybe a little bit of wobble, a bit more distortion, and you're well into Skrillex territory, all those serum style tones. Get them on any wavetable synth. So yeah, there's a lot to look at. Well, it feels like there's a lot to look at. And if we come further down here, there's some quite cool ones that show you just how flexible, how mad it can be. So this obviously looks a little bit crazy. So there's something odd going on with this one. And if we play it, let's just put the wave envelope on.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
There you go. Someone's saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
And we come to the next one.
19,
Do it a bit quicker.
19, 20, 19, 20.
So these are just vocal samples that have been chopped up into 64 separate single cycle waves. They sound quite computerized and robotic because they've been chopped up, but you can play it up and down the keyboards. It's like an early form of sampling.
19, 20, 19, 20, 19, 20.
So you can create your own if you want using samples. You can create your own using algorithms. You can create your own using the software in the synth itself. And actually I've got an editor that you can type in a phrase and it will create a vocal wavetable from it. But if we look in here, we go into the menu, we've got the wave editor. So inside this, actually, just to show you, we've got hundreds of user waves, 122 user waves, and those user waves are used to make wavetables. The wavetables refer back to them. If we come to a user wavetable, what I've been messing with maybe, this one I think, let's scroll through the waves. Here we go, user 2, user wave 2. So if we edit this, to a square and we can start playing around with it. If we play that, change it to a sawtooth. So you can spend forever playing around with these. It's not something I particularly do, but you can do it if you want. I do create wavetables from old synths and stuff because they're quite fun. So something like that's got, I don't know, the Voltage Lab 2, for example, from Pittsburgh Modular. It's got these really interesting oscillators. So if I sample the oscillator doing really strange things, then I can play that on anything else. So again, patrons have got that. It's on the website and stuff. But as far as the amount of wavetables that are out there, there's literally hundreds of thousands of them. Somebody sent me a link and I think he said it's got 120,000 of his wavetables in it. I've not looked at it yet. If it's any good, I'll stick a link in the description. But, you know, I think the $29 he said for 220,000. But if you want to play around with stuff, you've got forever to sit there and just get completely lost in it, which is a great thing. But also I can see why it's a daunting thing, because it was daunting for me when I got the XT. Now, loads simpler, graphical interfaces, you can see what each of the wavetables does. And if you want something a bit sharp and a bit bright, you can go straight to the ones that look a bit spiky. If you want something a bit calmer, you can see that it's calmer in the wavetable graphic itself. So loads easier these days than it used to be. The other thing people might not necessarily like about a digital synth is that it's not got that analog warmth. It's not what we're using these synths for, but if you wanted to recreate that analog warmth, you can do it in loads of things. It's quite simple. In this one, for example, if we go to the global menu, we've got these tuning tables, so we can actually detune each of the keys individually. So if I go into user 1 and then change the tuning on, let's go to C3. So I can go to each individual key and do different things with it, or I could just go to random. And you can hear that's randomizing the pitch. You can do things with the wavetables and you can modulate slowly through them, come into something a little bit more analogy because we're looking for an analog type tone. So the saw sweep again, let's start off central or somewhere like that, and then just modulate through that wavetable very, very gently. So go to oscillator 1, LFO 1, modulate through it. We don't want to do too much, make sure that's on smooth, go to the LFO, super slow that. Bit too much there, but you get the idea. Starting to get a little bit more analog. Maybe let's put the wave a little bit higher, get a bit brighter. Let's just add some release to that, make it a bit smoother sounding. Get in there, but now we're using the filter. If we go into the filter, this is an emulation of an analog filter. But again, if we come into this menu, we've got filter calibration. There's our 8 voices. We can just knock them around a little bit, get it a little bit knackered. Get it sounding exactly like all the analogs I've got in the studio that are all completely all over the place. I don't know, that'll deal with it. Let's just see what that sounds like. Probably no difference whatsoever. So you can start moving into analog territory quite easily. The Super 6 has got a slot mode, digital oscillators, analog filter, but you can make it sound really analog. Same with the Groove Synthesis third wave, you can make it sound really analog just by doing little things like this and having slot modes. Whether you'd really be concerned about it these days, I'm not too sure. Obviously, if you're spending an awful lot of money on one of those synths, yes, you might want to have that in your arsenal. But I can see back in the day why somebody might pick something like a 106 over a microwave, because they want those analog classic tones and you're not necessarily going to get them from the microwave. without a bit of effort. Whereas now, soft synths all over the place, as the guy said in the comments, haven't we had enough of them yet? Everyone's got a soft synth, so I wouldn't really worry too much about making analog tones with digital synths or digital oscillators, except for if I was just buying one big synth, and then in that case, you might want to have that in your arsenal. But overall, you know, you can do those things, but I think the reputation of stuff like this, like the microwaves in the past and the PPG, definitely sounded digital. So if you preferred the analog sound over the digital sound, you definitely go for the analog. Now, I don't think it's a thing. I think it's just a shame to miss out on all the things you can do with wavetables if you're a little bit scared of them or you're not quite sure how to use them. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of what wavetables are, why you would use them. You know, I think they're really nice, complex wave shapes that can get those twinkly sounds that you can't easily get from analog synths. You get all that weird digitalness if you want it. New synths, like as I keep on saying, third wave, you can just turn it off. But I tend to turn it on because I quite like it. But yeah, you don't have to have it, but it's there, and that's why it's there, and that's why all old digital synths don't sound the same, because they all act in different ways, so they do all have their own characters. The DW8000 doesn't sound like a microwave, for example, and that might be getting quite techie and quite detailed into things, but you know, that's the fun of it, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I hope that was of some use to somebody somewhere. And if it was, please do subscribe, ring the bell, join me over on Patreon. The channel is funded by affiliate links, my YouTube ads, and my wonderful patrons who get access to patches, samples, and all sorts of other goodies. Yeah, and all the Profit VS wavetables, and there's loads of wavetables on there as well. Also, do take a look at my Starsky Car website. Again, there's wavetables, there's patches, there's samples, there's stuff to buy, and there's stuff that you can download for free. And as I always say, nice if you pick up some of even the very cheap bits, because it really does all help to support the channel. So thanks very much for staying to the very end, and I will see you next time.